All right, guys, so I have some absolutely horrifying updates, predictably, coming out of Syria, Israel, and Gaza that I want to get to here. So we're just going to go ahead and jump into it. Starting off with this video that was released by Benjamin Netanyahu, where you can see him positioned here with his Israel flag and his flak jacket on, and he is standing alongside the IDF chief of staff on Mount Hermon in occupied Syrian territory. Now, the gist of the latest of Israeli policy when it comes to this region is that what was previously called by the US and by Israel temporarily at least as some sort of like a buffer zone that, oh, we're just going into this territory after the fall of Bashar al-Assad in Syria and the takeover by Syrian rebels led mostly by HTS, and I've covered them in previous videos as well. But the idea was Israel has to go in to this territory temporarily as a buffer zone to protect themselves, as a measure of national security, as a measure of self-defense, even though they were not attacked by Syria. That was sort of the logic that they went with. And now we have updated statements here from Israel indicating that they are planning on staying there indefinitely. Now, color me shocked, color me surprised that Israel would use this kind of an opportunity for another land grab, right? I'm absolutely stunned and shocked into oblivion that Israel would use this as an opportunity for a land grab, but that's exactly what it looks like they are doing here. Now, in terms of mapping this out on what territory we're actually talking about here, so here from the BBC, you look at the map here, you have Israel proper down here, you have Lebanon up here to the north, and then you have Syrian territory here. Now, this is the Golan Heights that has been illegally occupied by Israel since 1967. Now, the Trump administration previously recognized Israel's control over the Golan Heights as a massive handout to Israel after he took tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars from the pro-Israel lobby, including from Sheldon Adelson. It was, I think, upwards of over $100 million that he took the last time around. This time around, he's taken over $100 million from Miriam Adelson, the wife of the now dead Sheldon Adelson, to potentially allow Israel to fully annex the West Bank. So we know exactly what Trump's policy in regards to this territory here is, but this blue area are the positions that Israel has said that it has taken over after they were vacated by the Syrian army with the collapse of the Assad government. So here is Mount Hermon, the place that we just saw Benjamin Netanyahu in that video. So now they've extended their illegal occupation here from the Golan Heights to now include these blue areas as well. I mean, keep in mind, Syria did not attack Israel, right? Even since October 7th, as we had back and forth with Hezbollah in Lebanon and the Houthis in Yemen and attacks from Hamas in Gaza, even, support from Iran, you could include in that. Syria never attacked Israel throughout the entirety of this. And the new rebels who just took control of Syria really never gave any indication that they were going to attack Israel. So this is a totally preemptive sort of self-defense measure. At least that's what they're claiming, which makes absolutely no goddamn sense whatsoever under international law. But these are the new territories that they are occupying, and it seems like are going to indefinitely occupy until they can potentially settle them with Israelis. So, another sort of land grab opportunity as the Assad government fell that Israel's looking at here. Now, in terms of how the Western media is covering this is the only reason that I brought you guys this article, but it's amazing, right? So here's a headline, just as one example, from ABC News. Their headline is, Israel's borders have shifted throughout its history. They've shifted throughout its history. Action in Syria may reshape them again. And then in the byline here, they say Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says that Israeli troops will remain in Syrian territory indefinitely, and that blurs the border with Israel's northern neighbor. Imagine them ever discussing Russia's invasion of Ukraine in this same kind of way, right? Imagine if they said, Russia's borders have shifted throughout its history. Action in Ukraine may reshape them again, right? I mean, inevitably when we get to the point where there is some sort of a ceasefire deal or an end to the brutal war in Ukraine, you're probably going to end up with at least a demilitarized zone, if not Russian control over the Donbass, for example. Imagine U.S. media ever portraying it in this kind of way, right? No, they would be saying Putin's a war criminal. He's an imperialist. He is trying to do a land grab. And that's, of course, how they have been covering it the entire way throughout this war. And Putin is a war criminal, right? But notice the difference. If it's a U.S. State Department designated bad guy like Putin, the U.S. media falls in line and they will cover it in one way. When it's a U.S. State Department designated ally, they cover it in a completely different way. Suddenly, all of the language has to change around this. Now it's not an invasion, it's a buffer zone, right? It's self-defense. It's not an illegal occupation. It's not a land grab. They're just acting in Israel's national security interests, right? And you hear this also from the U.S. State Department. Here we have Matthew Miller, who said this. He says, "We have made quite clear that we believe the action ought to be temporary." Okay, you believe that? Is that what Israel's doing? That's the question here, right? In the same way that the State Department under Joe Biden, with ghouls like Matthew Miller and John Kirby and, Patel and others leading the charge, in the same way that when Israel threatened to go into Rafah, the Biden administration said, well, we don't believe that they should go into Rafah, right? Or we are potentially going to think about withholding weapons from Israel if they go in with a major military operation into Rafah in southern Gaza. Now look at what Rafah looks like, okay? It's been completely flattened to the ground. So what you guys say is the U.S. preference on Israeli policy is utterly and completely meaningless if you are unwilling to use the levers of power that you have at your disposal in order to put them in line with your strategic interests as you publicly state them, right? So if you're not willing to use the leverage that you have over Israel, namely withholding weapons from them, then these kinds of statements don't mean anything. They don't mean anything. U.S. policy under the Biden administration has been to allow Israel to do whatever they want, whenever they want, however they want. That has been the U.S. policy towards Israel for more than a year of this genocide in Gaza, continuing into the invasion of Lebanon, now continuing into the invasion and occupation of Syria as well. That's what U.S. policy has been under Joe Biden. And you should be under no delusions that it's going to get better under Trump. If anything, it will get much worse. Keep in mind, who has Trump picked to slot his cabinet positions? Guys like Marco Rubio, guys like Mike Waltz, neocons, if there ever were any, right? Also people like Mike Huckabee, who he chose to be his ambassador to Israel, a guy who literally believes in a Christian death cult philosophy that Israel needs to be in control of this entire region in order to bring about the second coming, and Jesus is going to fight the devil, and it's going to be the end of the world, and it's going to be immaculate and beautiful. These are the kinds of things that Trump's appointees believe in, right? So if anything, this kind of bullshit is only going to get worse in the next couple of years, right? We continue because I have some other updates that I want to get to here. We also have the newly elected chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, who we actually just had on Counterpoints today. Look out for that if you're not a premium member as a public viewer on Friday. But Greg Casar just released this statement here, calling out the Biden administration for continuing to transfer weapons to Israel despite Benjamin Netanyahu failing to meet the demands that Biden gave them, right? So they give this preamble here, but then they break it down pretty simply to give us an idea in terms of like, what have the Biden administration's so-called demands been, and how has Israel matched up to that, right? So 3 major things that they point out here. Number 1, humanitarian aid trucks entering into Gaza. So the U.S. demand from this October 13th letter that we covered at the time was to enable a minimum of 350 humanitarian aid trucks per day into Gaza. The reality, since then, an average of 42 aid trucks have entered Gaza daily, with as few as 6 trucks on some days. So you're not even a fraction of the way towards meeting the Biden administration's demands that they laid out in this letter, right? Now, they continue. They say, number 2, humanitarian pauses. The U.S. demand was to institute adequate humanitarian pauses across Gaza as necessary to enable humanitarian activities. The reality, the 3rd phase of Gaza's polio vaccination campaign was delayed in moving forward because of escalating violence. When the vaccinations did begin, medical professionals were not provided with access to northern Gaza, and a vaccination center was attacked by the Israeli military during a humanitarian pause. Let me say that again. A vaccination center was attacked by the IDF during a humanitarian pause. Now, number 3 is to end the isolation of northern Gaza. The U.S. demand was that there will be no Israeli government policy of forced evacuation of civilians from northern to southern Gaza, and to ensure humanitarian organizations have continuous access to northern Gaza. We'll get to more of this here in a second, because they're, at this point, doing a total permanent ethnic cleansing of the entire northern third of the Gaza Strip, which previous to October 7th, Gaza was already one of, if not the single most densely populated places on the face of the planet. Right now, they're chopping a third off of that and saying we're totally ethnically cleansing this entire portion of Gaza. Now, they say the reality is that the leading humanitarian organizations reported last month that not only did the Israeli government fail to meet the Biden administration's criteria, but that it, quote, concurrently took actions that dramatically worsened the situation on the ground, particularly in northern Gaza. According to the United Nations, the Netanyahu government has denied 82 out of 91, so almost all of them, attempts since October 6th of this year to deliver aid to cut off areas in northern Gaza. So they've completely shut off aid getting to northern Gaza, which is the place that needs it the most here. Now, they also say here, moving on to our next portion here, actually, I'll bump this up because this is tying into what we were just discussing here. Dropsite News is reporting that Israel, again, is planning to fully ethnically cleanse the northern third of Gaza. So Israel's Ynet reports that IDF is implementing plans to prevent Palestinians from returning to their homes in Jabalia even after the current siege ends. So this is according to the general's plan that I've covered extensively on this channel before, which aims to keep the northern Gaza Strip sparsely populated unless a hostage deal changes the situation. The dismemberment access from Gaza Village to the sea will remain intact, forcing the 65,000 who fled Gaza City to stay or possibly be pushed further south to the Netzarim corridor in upcoming raids. And Israeli Defense Minister Katz stated, quote, after we defeat Hamas, we will control security in Gaza, just like in Judea and Samaria, by which he means the West Bank. Okay, so essentially what you have here is the Israeli Defense Minister confirming that not only is Israel planning to completely ethnically cleanse the northern third of Gaza, after the entire population has been displaced, they've attacked schools and mosques and churches and hospitals and, residential buildings and everything under the sun, and displaced the entire population there. Even after all of that, they're saying, not only are we ethnically cleansing the northern third of Gaza, but we are going to treat the rest of Gaza as essentially occupied Israeli territory. That's what they're saying here. You know, if he's making the comparison to the West Bank, well, the West Bank is being illegally occupied by Israeli occupation forces. So they're saying we're going to use the same strategy as we are in the West Bank, pushing that towards Gaza. So, to call this an obvious genocide, to call this an obvious illegal occupation, would be the understatement of the century. Now, at the same time, I wanted to get to this portion of the story as well, because Ireland seems to be one of the only countries on the face of the planet that is willing to, actually fight against this genocide and to try to do their part. Now, it shouldn't be surprising if you know the background context and the history of Ireland as an occupied place, as, a place that has suffered famines and genocides of themselves by a colonial power in England. It shouldn't be surprising that they have some sort of a political overlap and an understanding of the plight of the Palestinian people. But the latest information coming out of the relationship between Israel and Ireland is that Israel is now closing their Dublin embassy after Ireland supported the ICJ, the International Court of Justice's genocide petition. Now, the Israeli foreign minister said that the move was prompted by the Irish government's extreme anti-Israel policy, by which they mean the Irish government, again, has sympathies for Palestinians, given similar plights that they have faced. And they are trying to hold the Israeli government to the standards of international law. That's what they're talking about here. They call that extreme anti-Israel policies. Now, there were also accusations of anti-Semitism, right? Ireland is radically anti-Semitic because they are willing to hold Israel to the standards of international law. That's essentially what this story is. Now, in response to Israel pulling their embassy and shutting it down. We have a couple different videos that I lined up here that I saw float across my TikTok feed. First, we have here, not even going to pronounce this first term here, but this is Simon Harris, a top minister in Ireland, who had this to say about the entire situation. And in terms of Israel trying to use this story of them pulling their embassy from Dublin as sort of a distraction from the real story, which is what's actually happening in Gaza. And he does a phenomenal job here. So let's go ahead and watch this.
I'd respectfully suggest that possibly because it works as a distraction. You're all here today asking me about Ireland's position. What about Israel's actions? What about what Netanyahu is doing to the innocent children of Gaza? This is the diplomacy of distraction. And I think it is deeply regrettable that they took that decision. They have every right to take that decision to close the embassy. I'd rather it didn't happen. We will continue to engage diplomatically. But nobody's going to silence Ireland. I believe in freedom of speech and people are entitled to articulate their views, but they're not entitled to have an alternative set of facts. What's happening in the Middle East, what's happening in Gaza is extraordinarily serious. I mean, Ireland's position has been clear on this from day one. We want to see the release of all hostages, absolutely. We condemned the horrific terrorist attack by Hamas on Israel, 100%, absolutely, a horrific terrorist attack. But we also know that there are innocent children who are dying, who are being maimed, who are suffering in a way that I'm not sure the whole world can yet even fully comprehend until we see and get into Gaza. There is humanitarian aid that isn't not just not flowing, it's actually getting worse. I mean, there are reports from UN agencies that show not only did the situation not improve in recent times, it significantly disimproved.
This is what it would look like if we had a government here in the United States that wasn't fully bought and paid for by the Israel lobby. Right? This is the kind of statement that you would get from any reasonable human being looking at the images out of Gaza, looking at the Israeli policy towards Gaza for over a year now, for really years before that as well, for decades going on now. So shout out to our boy Simon Harris over in Ireland. We also have the president here making a statement about the allegations of anti-Semitism against Ireland for their criticism of Israel. So let's go ahead and watch this clip here as well.
I think it is a very serious business to actually brand a people because, in fact, they disagree with Prime Minister Netanyahu, who is in breach of so many bits of international law and who has breached the sovereignty of three of his neighbours in relation to Lebanon and Syria, and would like, in fact, actually to have a settlement in Egypt. I think to suggest that because one criticises Prime Minister Netanyahu, that one is anti-Semitic, is such a gross defamation and slander. But I have to say that originally when I was accepted credentials, I put it down to lack of experience, but then I saw later that it was part of a pattern to damage Ireland.
Yeah, I mean, he's absolutely right. And listen, I've never been more proud of my my family ancestry in Ireland because Ireland is one of the few and far between countries that are willing to stand up to up to Israel. And when I say that, I mean most of the world is actually in favor of a Palestinian state, and they believe what Israel is doing is wrong. When I say he's one of a few, I mean mostly Western European countries and the United States and our allies that continue to defend Israel at the hip. Right? He's not alone, but he is pretty isolated when it comes to European politics in relation to Israel. So credit to Ireland for standing up for what they believe in and for being on the right side of history. Right? There's nothing really more that you can say about this. They're absolutely right on the facts of it in terms of what Israel has been doing in Gaza, their invasion of Lebanon, their invasion of Syria, their back and forth with the Houthis and Iran as well. They're absolutely right about it. Right. And it seems to be that some of the most reasonable politicians in the world exist in Ireland. Now, if you wanted further information in terms of a total report on what Israel has been doing in Gaza, Amnesty International earlier in December actually released their full report, concluding that they believe that Israel is committing genocide against Palestinians in Gaza. Now, we've been covering this for, again, over a year at this point. The genocide conclusion is not a complicated one. It's not a difficult one to anybody who has a principled stance on this and who understands the definition of genocide under international law. This is not a difficult thing to conclude, but they put together, I read this whole report. a pretty thorough breakdown of exactly how Israel has been violating international law and how they have violated the Genocide Convention as well. So if you want a thorough report on all of this and more background information, this of course will be down in the description below for you guys to go and read. But again, at this point, this far into it, there is no way to look at what Israel has done in Gaza and to conclude anything other than this is genocide. I mean, if this is not a genocide, then the word has absolutely no meaning. And it's an unfortunate reality that the US and our allies, especially in Western Europe, have so much influence over international politics that this would even become a complicated question, or that we would have to be having discussions over whether it's anti-Semitic to discuss the war crimes that are being perpetrated against Palestinians. That is purely an Israeli government PR or propaganda allegation that's being made, right? That's part of the strategy, is to smear anybody who is critical of their actions as anti-Semitic, okay? Notice how in my coverage, I never mention the Jewish people as a whole. I never mentioned Judaism as a faith, as a religion, as, Jews as an ethnicity or anything like that. We talk about Israeli government policy and the consequences of Israeli government policy, fully backed by the United States, my home country here as well. We don't have those conversations because it's irrelevant, okay? The relevant conversation is, again, about Israeli government policy and their actions and what the consequences of those actions are and whether or not they comply with or violate international law. That's the conversation that we are having over here on the left, right? Not to say that anti-Semitism is not an issue. Of course it is here in the United States and around the rest of the world. Usually happens to be a right-wing or a fascist issue when it comes to that. But, this idea that Ireland is, they're full of anti-Semites. I mean, it's utterly ridiculous to anybody who has a non-warped and principled stance on this kind of an issue. And I'll finish off with this because this is just some of the latest horrors coming out of Gaza. So here from Al Jazeera English, Israeli forces have bombed the UN-run Ahmed bin Abdul Aziz school in Gaza's Khan Yunis. The attack continues Israel's repeated pattern of targeting former school buildings, with some sheltering up to 65,000 displaced Palestinians. And you can see from the video here, somebody saying that it was all children, civilians. They didn't tell us to evacuate. How can they bomb a school? Unfortunately, this is the reality of what has been happening in Gaza over and over and over again. I mean, at this point, it's borderline impossible to find an image of Gaza in its current state where the entirety, I mean, from the point of view of the person taking the picture all the way to the horizon, is not leveled infrastructure to the ground. There is nothing in sight that is still standing, that has not been bombed out. They have destroyed everything in Gaza. They have targeted the schools, the hospitals, the UN shelters, the refugee camps, and everything in between. So again, not a complicated issue. At this point, if you're still falling behind and you need more information, fucking follow my channel, okay? I'll continue to give you guys updates. And we'll continue to make the case that this is beyond reprehensible. It's beyond illegal. It's beyond criminal. But it is a forever stain on humanity that we have allowed this to go on for as long as it has.
Politic guy has the best politic. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me, everyone is saying